In the quiet outskirts of a suburban neighborhood stood Mark's warehouse, a testament to years of dedication and entrepreneurial spirit. This wasn't just any logistics business. It was the culmination of countless hours of planning, risk-taking, and unwavering determination. The facility's location had been carefully chosen, strategically positioned to balance accessibility with operational efficiency. The warehouse itself, while not architecturally remarkable, represented something far more significant: the American dream of building something from the ground up. The parking lot, spanning a considerable portion of the property, was more than just an expanse of asphalt. It was the lifeblood of Mark's operation, meticulously designed to accommodate the complex choreography of daily business activities. Each morning, delivery trucks would arrive in a carefully orchestrated sequence, their drivers expertly maneuvering into designated spaces that allowed for efficient loading and unloading. Employee vehicles occupied their own section, a practical arrangement that ensured smooth operations while maintaining clear access routes for the constant flow of commercial traffic. Mark had developed his business with precision and foresight. The warehouse's location, while close to residential areas, maintained a professional distance that allowed for commercial operations without disturbing the nearby community. This careful balance had been intentional, a buffer zone that respected both his business needs and the residential character of the neighborhood beyond. The parking lot's layout reflected this thoughtful approach, with clearly marked spaces, wide lanes for truck movement, and designated areas for different types of vehicles. The daily rhythm of the warehouse was a well-oiled machine. Early mornings saw the arrival of the first shift employees, their cars filling the designated staff parking area in an orderly fashion. Throughout the day, delivery trucks would come and go, their schedules coordinated to maximize efficiency and minimize congestion. The loading docks remained accessible at all times, a crucial factor in maintaining the timely flow of goods that was the cornerstone of Mark's business model. This wasn't just about parking spaces. It was about maintaining a professional operation that supported multiple families through stable employment and contributed to the local economy. Mark's employees relied on this system working smoothly, their livelihoods dependent on the ability to arrive at work on time and perform their duties efficiently. The warehouse had become a small but significant hub in the larger logistics network, its reliability built on the foundation of well-planned infrastructure and operational clarity. The property's independence from the adjacent residential community had been a deliberate choice, one that Mark had made to ensure his business could operate without constraints. The clear property lines and private ownership status were not just legal technicalities. They were essential elements that allowed him to maintain control over his business environment and ensure compliance with commercial regulations. In many ways, the status quo represented a perfect balance, a successful business operation that neither imposed upon nor was imposed upon by its neighbors. The warehouse stood as a symbol of professional achievement, its well-maintained grounds and organized operations a source of pride for Mark and his team. This was the culmination of his entrepreneurial journey, a dream realized through careful planning and dedicated execution. The morning that changed everything started like any other, but quickly evolved into a stark reminder of how quickly order can descend into chaos. As Mark approached his warehouse that fateful morning, the first glimpse of unfamiliar vehicles scattered throughout his parking lot sent a ripple of concern through his mind. The sight was jarring, a complete departure from the organized system he had carefully maintained for years. The invasion of his parking lot wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It represented a fundamental disruption to the entire operation of his business. Where delivery trucks normally had clear access to loading docks, now stood a hodgepodge of civilian vehicles, sedans, SUVs, and minivans parked with casual disregard for the clearly marked commercial spaces. The sight of a delivery truck idling helplessly at the entrance, unable to navigate through the maze of unauthorized vehicles, was a stark illustration of the immediate impact on his business operations. The vehicles themselves told a story, many bearing stickers from the nearby residential community, some parked haphazardly across multiple spaces, others blocking crucial access points. This wasn't a random occurrence, but appeared to be a coordinated action, though the coordination clearly hadn't considered the implications for Mark's business operations. The casual way in which residents had appropriated his private property suggested an assumption of right that was both puzzling and infuriating. Inside the warehouse, the disruption was already rippling through the day's operations. Employees who had arrived early reported difficulty finding parking, some forced to leave their vehicles in inappropriate locations or seek spots on nearby streets. The morning's deliveries were backing up, with trucks unable to access their designated areas. The carefully orchestrated flow of business that Mark had developed over years was grinding to a halt in the face of this unexpected obstacle. The human impact was immediately apparent. Mark's employees, accustomed to starting their day smoothly, now faced unnecessary stress and delays. Delivery drivers, operating on tight schedules, were forced to wait or seek alternative arrangements. The professional atmosphere that Mark had worked so hard to maintain was being eroded by the confusion and frustration of dealing with this unprecedented situation. The contrast between the usual order and the current chaos was striking. Where once there had been a clear system for vehicle movement and parking, now there was only confusion. The carefully designated spaces that ensured efficient operations were now occupied by vehicles that had no business being there. The professional boundary between commercial and residential areas, once so clear, had been breached without warning or apparent consideration for the consequences. As Mark surveyed the scene, the full scope of the disruption became clear. This wasn't just about inconvenience, it was a direct threat to his business operations. The inability to receive deliveries on schedule could ripple through his entire supply chain. The difficulty for employees to access their workplace could impact productivity and morale. The professional image he had cultivated could be damaged by the appearance of disorder and the inability to maintain normal operations. The sight of residents casually walking to and from their vehicles, seemingly oblivious to the havoc they were creating, added another layer of complexity to the situation. This wasn't a malicious act by individuals, but rather appeared to be the result of some authority giving them permission to use the space, permission that Mark knew he had never granted. The question of who had orchestrated this invasion, and under what authority, would soon become central to the unfolding conflict. The walk to the HOA's community center felt longer than its actual distance, each step carrying the weight of Mark's mounting frustration. The pristine landscaping and perfectly maintained facades of the neighborhood seemed to mock the chaos they had unleashed on his business. The contrast between the community's manicured appearance and their disregard for his property rights wasn't lost on him. It spoke volumes about the priorities at play. Inside the HOA office, the carefully cultivated atmosphere of authority was immediately apparent. The reception area, with its polished surfaces and professional decor, set the stage for what would become a pivotal confrontation. Miss Langston's office, where Mark was eventually led, was a testament to the power she wielded within the community. Family photos and community awards decorated the walls, creating an image of leadership and respectability that would soon be challenged. The meeting itself revealed layers of institutional arrogance that took Mark's breath away. Miss Langston's demeanor, poised, confident, and utterly dismissive of his concerns, embodied the very essence of unchecked authority. Her initial response to his complaints was particularly telling. A practiced smile and a tone that suggested she was doing him a favor by even entertaining his concerns. "I'm sorry to hear about the inconvenience," she had said, her words dripping with condescension. "But we had to find a solution for our residents' parking." The casual way she dismissed his property rights was stunning. It wasn't just that she believed the HOA had the authority to commandeer his lot. It was the absolute certainty with which she presented this belief, as if the very idea of questioning it was absurd. The conversation quickly escalated as Mark pushed back against her assumptions. Each exchange revealed more about the HOA's mindset. They hadn't just made a decision affecting his property. They had done so without even considering the need to consult him. The phrase, "it seemed like a logical choice," particularly stood out. Logical for whom? Certainly not for the business owner whose operations were being severely disrupted. As the confrontation unfolded, Miss Langston's facade of professional courtesy began to crack. Her dismissive wave of the hand when Mark mentioned the impact on his business, her hardening tone when he challenged their authority, These were the actions of someone unaccustomed to having their decisions questioned. The power dynamic she had expected, the HOA president graciously explaining policy to a compliant community member, was being upended by Mark's refusal to accept their overreach. The meeting reached its climax when Miss Langston attempted to intimidate Mark with vague threats about the HOA's resources and influence. It was a telling moment. When reasoned arguments failed, she resorted to power plays. This wasn't about community needs anymore. It was about authority being challenged and responding with threats rather than solutions. Mark's departure from the office, fists clenched and anger barely contained, marked more than the end of a meeting. It was the moment when lines were drawn and positions became entrenched. The HOA's actions had transformed from a simple parking dispute into a battle over fundamental rights and the limits of institutional power. The 48-hour ultimatum Mark issued wasn't just a deadline. It was a test of both his patience and the HOA's response to reasonable demands. These 2 days would reveal much about both parties' true characters and set the stage for the conflict's escalation. Mark's decision to provide this warning period demonstrated his commitment to handling the situation professionally, despite the HOA's provocative actions. During these crucial 48 hours, the parking lot became a stage where the drama played out in real time. More cars appeared, if anything, seeming to mock his warning. Residents continued their casual appropriation of his property, some even waving to him as they walked past. Their friendly gestures, a stark contrast to the hostile takeover they were participating in. Each new vehicle that appeared was another nail in the coffin of diplomatic resolution. Mark used this time strategically, documenting everything meticulously. His phone became filled with photographs. Cars parked illegally, blocked loading docks, frustrated delivery drivers trying to navigate the chaos. He recorded dates, times, license plate numbers, creating a paper trail that would prove invaluable later. This wasn't just about building a case, it was about demonstrating the systematic nature of the disruption to his business. The warning period also revealed the broader impact on his business operations. Delivery schedules were disrupted, causing a domino effect throughout his supply chain. His employees, loyal and hardworking, faced daily struggles just to get to work. The stress was beginning to show, in missed deadlines, in frustrated phone calls from clients, in the growing tension among his staff. Each hour that passed without HOA action added to the mounting costs, both financial and emotional. Communication attempts during this period were particularly telling. Mark's calls to the HOA office were met with delay tactics and vague responses. His emails, clearly stating his position and the consequences of inaction, received only automated replies or dismissive responses. The HOA's strategy became clear. They were hoping to wait him out, assuming he would eventually accept their fait accompli. The community's reaction during these 48 hours was mixed. Some residents, learning of the situation, expressed embarrassment and apologized for their association's actions. Others doubled down, defending the HOA's decision with arguments about community needs, trumping private property rights. These interactions revealed deep divisions within the community itself, divisions that would only widen as the conflict escalated. Karen, Mark's assistant, became an unexpected ally during this period. Her documentation of daily disruptions, her handling of increasingly complex logistics to keep the business running, and her moral support proved invaluable. She helped maintain a level of professionalism even as the situation deteriorated, reminding everyone that they were dealing with more than just a parking dispute. This was about their livelihoods. As the 48-hour deadline approached, the lack of response from the HOA spoke volumes. Their silence wasn't just a failure to communicate, it was a calculated statement of their position. They had chosen to ignore reasonable requests, to dismiss legitimate concerns, and to maintain their course of action regardless of the consequences. This non-response would prove to be a crucial mistake, one that would justify Mark's next steps and ultimately contribute to their undoing. The end of the warning period marked a turning point. Mark had given them an opportunity to correct their overreach, to engage in dialogue to find a mutually acceptable solution. Their failure to do so not only justified his next actions, but also revealed the true nature of their leadership, an authority more interested in wielding power than serving their community. In the face of institutional opposition, Mark understood that his success would depend not just on being right, but on being able to prove it. His approach to documentation became a masterclass in protecting one's interests against overreach. Each step was calculated, each piece of evidence carefully preserved, creating a foundation that would ultimately prove unassailable. The process began with the physical transformation of the property. Mark invested in professional no parking signs, ensuring they met all legal requirements. These weren't just warnings, they were legal declarations of his property rights. He positioned them strategically around the lot, photographing each installation with timestamps and GPS coordinates. The sign's message was clear and unambiguous. No parking, private property. Violators will be towed at owner's expense. His documentation extended beyond mere photographs. Mark created a comprehensive digital record of the entire situation. Each morning, he conducted a methodical survey of the lot, recording vehicle positions, license plate numbers, and timestamps. He used his phone's video function to capture continuous footage of the disruption to his business operations. Delivery trucks unable to access loading docks, employees struggling to find parking, the daily chaos. All of it was preserved in high-definition detail. Communication became another crucial aspect of his documentation strategy. Every email, every phone call, every interaction with the HOA was logged and archived. He maintained a detailed timeline of events from the first appearance of unauthorized vehicles to each attempted communication with the HOA leadership. His emails to Miss Langston and the HOA board were particularly careful in their wording, always professional yet firm, creating a paper trail that demonstrated both his reasonableness and their intransigence. The financial impact on his business didn't go unrecorded either. Mark worked with his accountant to create detailed reports showing the monetary costs of the disruption: lost delivery times, employee tardiness, contract penalties due to delays. Each loss was meticulously calculated and documented. These numbers would later prove crucial in demonstrating the real-world impact of the HOA's actions. Legal consultation played a vital role during this phase. Mark's attorney reviewed each piece of documentation, ensuring it would hold up under scrutiny. They discussed the importance of maintaining an objective tone in all communications, avoiding emotional language that could undermine their position. The lawyer's guidance helped shape Mark's documentation strategy, focusing on elements that would prove most relevant in a legal context. Perhaps most importantly, Mark documented the human impact of the situation. Employee statements, delivery driver complaints, client concerns, all were collected and preserved. These testimonials added a crucial dimension to his case, transforming it from a simple property dispute into a story about real people whose livelihoods were being affected by the HOA's arbitrary decision. The involvement of Karen, his assistant, proved invaluable in this documentation phase. Her organizational skills helped create a systematic approach to recording events. She established a digital filing system that made every piece of evidence easily accessible, categorized by date, type, and relevance. Her own daily logs of disruptions and interactions added another layer of credibility to their documentation. As the days passed, this growing body of evidence began to tell a compelling story. It wasn't just about unauthorized parking anymore. It was about a systematic abuse of power and its impact on a legitimate business. Each new piece of documentation added weight to their position, building toward an inevitable confrontation. The decision to take action wasn't made lightly. After exhausting every diplomatic avenue and accumulating overwhelming evidence, Mark knew the time had come to reclaim his property. The early morning operation was planned with military precision, a coordinated effort to restore order to the chaos that had engulfed his business. Dawn hadn't yet broken when the first tow trucks arrived. Mark had chosen a reputable company with experience in similar situations, ensuring they understood both the legal requirements and the need for professional conduct. 4 trucks lined up at the entrance to the lot, their drivers briefed on the operation's procedures and the importance of following proper protocol. The documentation continued even during the action phase. Each vehicle removal was photographed and videoed, with timestamps and license plate numbers carefully recorded. The towing company's own documentation added another layer of legitimacy to the process. Every step was by the book, leaving no room for legal challenges. The operation itself was a study in efficiency. The tow truck operators worked systematically, starting with the vehicles blocking critical access points. Each removal followed a strict procedure: documentation, verification against posted warnings, proper securing of the vehicle, and careful transportation. The professionalism of the operation stood in stark contrast to the casual disregard that had characterized the unauthorized parking. As the sun rose and the community began to stir, the impact of Mark's action became apparent. The first residents arriving to find their cars missing reacted with a mix of shock, anger, and disbelief. Mark had anticipated this reaction, preparing information packets with the towing company's contact details and copies of the relevant laws and regulations. Karen handled these interactions with remarkable composure, maintaining professionalism in the face of increasingly heated confrontations. The transformation of the lot was dramatic. With each vehicle removed, order was gradually restored. Delivery trucks could once again access the loading docks. Employees found their designated spaces available, and the business operations began to return to normal. The physical cleared spaces represented more than just parking. They were a visible assertion of property rights and business necessity. Word spread quickly through the community. Some residents arrived in time to see their vehicles being towed, leading to tense confrontations. Mark had anticipated this as well, ensuring that security cameras were operational and that all interactions were recorded. His calm demeanor in the face of angry accusations spoke to his confidence in the righteousness of his position. The arrival of Miss Langston and other HOA board members marked a crucial moment in the operation. Their attempts to halt the towing were met with firm but professional resistance. Mark presented them with copies of all relevant documentation: the warnings, the legal notices, the photographic evidence of their violations. Their threats of legal action fell flat against the wall of careful preparation and documentation he had built. Throughout the morning, Mark maintained his composure, even as chaos swirled around him. He understood that his actions would have consequences, that relationships within the community would be strained, but he also knew that sometimes maintaining one's rights required difficult decisions. The operation wasn't just about removing vehicles. It was about establishing boundaries and demanding respect for private property rights. By noon, the parking lot had been restored to its intended purpose. The final tally of removed vehicles served as a stark reminder of how extensive the HOA's overreach had been. But more importantly, the action had sent a clear message. Mark's business was not a resource to be commandeered at will, and his property rights were not up for negotiation. The aftermath of the towing operation would reveal much about the community's character and the HOA's true nature. But for now, Mark had accomplished his immediate goal: reclaiming his property and restoring his business operations. The next phase of the conflict would be fought not with tow trucks, but with lawyers and public opinion. The aftermath of the towing operation unfolded like a cascade of dominoes, each reaction triggering new and unexpected consequences. The parking lot, now restored to its intended purpose, became ground zero for a community in turmoil. The morning air was thick with tension as residents arrived to find their vehicles missing, their routine disrupted, and their assumptions of entitlement shattered. The initial wave of reactions was visceral and intense. Angry residents gathered at the warehouse entrance, their voices rising in a chorus of indignation. Some arrived dressed for work, others still in their morning attire, all united in their shock and outrage. The scene was chaos contained only by the thin line of professionalism that Mark and his staff maintained. Each confrontation tested their resolve. Each angry accusation required a measured response. Among the crowd, distinct factions began to emerge. Some residents, particularly those who had lost their vehicles, were openly hostile. Their anger was personal, immediate, and largely blind to the broader context of property rights and business operations. Others, however, showed signs of understanding. These residents, often older property owners or fellow business people, recognized the legitimacy of Mark's actions, even if they didn't openly support them. The arrival of Miss Langston transformed the atmosphere from mere chaos to concentrated confrontation. Her presence drew the scattered groups of angry residents into a more organized force. She moved through the crowd like a conductor, her words carefully chosen to stoke indignation while maintaining a veneer of professional concern. "This is an outrage," she declared, her voice carrying across the parking lot. "The HOA will not stand for this assault on our community." Inside the warehouse, Mark's employees watched the unfolding drama with mixed emotions. For them, the return of their parking spaces was a welcome relief, but the hostile atmosphere outside created new tensions. Some worried about retaliation, others about the long-term implications for their jobs. Karen took on the role of internal communicator, keeping the staff informed while maintaining their focus on daily operations. The police made several appearances throughout the morning, called by both residents and the HOA. Each time they reviewed the documentation Mark had prepared, confirmed the legality of his actions, and explained to the gathered crowd that this was a civil matter. Their presence, while necessary, added another layer of tension to the already charged atmosphere. Social media exploded with posts about the incident. Residents shared their stories, most one-sided and emotionally charged. Pictures of tow trucks and angry confrontations circulated rapidly through community groups. The narrative began to split, one side painting Mark as a heartless business owner, the other recognizing him as a property owner defending his rights against institutional overreach. By evening, the immediate chaos had subsided, but the community was irrevocably changed. Lines had been drawn, positions taken, and relationships altered. The parking lot was clear, but the air was heavy with the knowledge that this was only the beginning of a larger conflict. The HOA's response to their tactical defeat was calculated and comprehensive, marking a shift from casual overreach to organized retaliation. The escalation began subtly but quickly gathered momentum, revealing the true depths of institutional power when challenged. The first salvo came in the form of flyers, appearing overnight like malicious leaves scattered throughout the community. Professionally printed on high-quality paper, they painted Mark as an enemy of community harmony, a businessman whose selfish actions had disrupted the lives of hardworking residents. The language was careful, legally vetted, but the intent was clear: to turn public opinion against him. Miss Langston orchestrated a masterful campaign of social pressure. Using the HOA's newsletter and email list, she crafted a narrative that portrayed the association as a defender of community interests against corporate greed. The parking issue was reframed as a story of a business owner refusing to help his neighbors, rather than a property rights violation. Each communication was a carefully constructed piece of propaganda, designed to isolate Mark and pressure him into compliance. The intimidation tactics grew more sophisticated. Anonymous calls began coming to the warehouse, usually during busy periods. Delivery trucks reported being followed and photographed. Small groups of residents would gather near the property line, watching and taking notes. None of these actions were explicitly threatening, but their cumulative effect created an atmosphere of surveillance and pressure. Legal threats arrived in official-looking envelopes, each more ominous than the last. The HOA's lawyers cited obscure regulations and threatened various forms of legal action. While Mark's own attorney assured him these threats were largely baseless, responding to each one required time and resources. The strategy was clear: death by 1,000 paper cuts. The business impact became more direct. Negative reviews began appearing online, many from accounts that had never interacted with Mark's company. Local business groups received letters questioning his ethics and commitment to the community. Some long-term clients called to express concern about the controversy, having been contacted by concerned community members. Karen discovered attempts to contact their employees directly. The HOA had somehow obtained internal email addresses and was reaching out to staff members, suggesting that their job security might be at risk due to Mark's confrontational stance. These attempts at dividing his workforce were particularly insidious, targeting the very people who depended on the business for their livelihoods. The campaign extended into the physical realm. The previously pristine exterior of the warehouse began experiencing minor vandalism. Nothing serious enough to warrant major police involvement, but enough to require constant cleanup and repair. Security cameras caught shadows moving at night, but never clearly enough for identification. The message was clear. Resistance would have consequences. Most disturbing was the attempt to isolate Mark personally. He began receiving invitations to community reconciliation meetings that felt more like planned ambushes. Neighbors he had known casually for years suddenly became cold and distant. Even at local businesses, he could feel eyes on him, hear the whispers that followed him. Throughout this escalation, Mark maintained meticulous records. Each flyer, each email, each incident was documented and added to the growing file his lawyer maintained. The HOA's campaign of pressure was building its own case against itself, revealing a pattern of organized retaliation that would ultimately strengthen Mark's position. The escalation phase revealed the true nature of the conflict. What had begun as a dispute over parking spaces had evolved into a battle over power, influence, and the limits of institutional authority. The HOA's response to being challenged exposed a darker side of community governance, where the manipulation of public opinion and the use of social pressure became weapons in maintaining control. As the pressure mounted, Mark found himself at a crucial decision point. He could either bow to the increasing pressure, sacrificing his property rights for peace, or continue standing his ground, knowing that the conflict would likely get worse before it got better. His choice would not only affect his business, but would set a precedent for how institutional power could be challenged and confronted. The email arrived late one evening as Mark was reviewing the latest incident reports. "I read about your situation," it began. "The same thing happened to me 2 years ago." The sender was Richard Davidson, owner of a small manufacturing facility 3 miles away. His message would prove to be the first thread in a web of support that would change the entire dynamic of Mark's battle against the HOA. Richard's story was eerily familiar. His business had faced similar encroachment from the same HOA, though in his case they had attempted to force him to allow community use of his employee parking lot during local events. The similarities were striking, down to the tactical pressure campaign that followed his refusal. But Richard had prevailed, and his experience offered something Mark desperately needed: a blueprint for survival. Their first meeting took place at a quiet diner well outside the HOA's sphere of influence. Richard, a weathered man in his 60s with sharp eyes and careful speech, brought with him a thick folder of documents. "They count on isolation," he explained, spreading out papers across the table. "They win by making you feel alone, making you doubt yourself. But you're not alone, not by a long shot." As they talked, Richard revealed a network of local business owners who had faced similar battles. Sarah Chen from the local garden center who fought off attempts to regulate her delivery hours. Michael Patterson, whose storage facility had resisted demands for community access. Each had their own story of HOA overreach, and each had found ways to fight back. The alliance began to take shape organically. Weekly meetings evolved into strategy sessions, with each member contributing their unique experiences and resources. Sarah offered her expertise in local zoning laws, having successfully navigated a complex rezoning battle. Michael shared his contacts in local government, relationships built over years of community involvement. Richard's experience with media relations proved invaluable in crafting their message. What emerged was more than just a support group. It was a coordinated response to institutional overreach. They shared security footage, documenting patterns of harassment that extended beyond Mark's property. They pooled resources for legal representation, engaging a firm with experience in property rights cases. Most importantly, they created a united front that challenged the HOA's narrative of isolated troublemakers. The impact of this alliance reached beyond their immediate circle. Other business owners, hearing of their collaboration, began sharing their own stories. A pattern emerged of systematic attempts by the HOA to extend their authority beyond their legal boundaries. Each story added weight to their cause, transforming individual grievances into evidence of a larger problem. Linda Martinez, a local real estate agent, became an unexpected ally. Her insider knowledge of property values and community dynamics contradicted the HOA's claims about business impact. "They're lying about property values," she revealed during one meeting. "The data shows that mixed-use development actually increases home values in this area." Her professional reputation lent credibility to their position. The alliance's strength lay not just in numbers, but in diversity. Each member brought different perspectives and skills to the table. An accountant offered to analyze the financial impact of the HOA's actions. A retired lawyer volunteered to review their documentation. A marketing professional helped craft their message for maximum impact. Through this network, Mark discovered something crucial: the power of shared experience. Each story of resistance, each small victory against overreach, reinforced his resolve. The isolation that the HOA had worked so hard to create began to crumble in the face of collective support. Rachel Chen wasn't looking for a story about parking disputes when she began investigating local HOA practices. As an investigative reporter for the City Tribune, her focus had been on broader issues of community governance and property rights. But something about Mark's situation caught her attention. Perhaps it was the detailed documentation or the emerging pattern of similar cases across the region. Her first contact with Mark was cautious. "I understand you're having some issues with your local HOA," her email began professionally. "I'd like to hear your side of the story." Mark, initially hesitant about media attention, consulted with his alliance before agreeing to meet. The decision would prove pivotal in shifting the narrative. The interview took place at the warehouse, where Rachel could see firsthand the impact of the dispute. She arrived early, observing the morning delivery routine and taking notes on the facility's operations. Her attention to detail was evident in the questions she asked, not just about the parking dispute, but about the broader implications for business owners and community rights. "This isn't just about parking spaces, is it?" she probed, her recorder capturing every word. "This is about power, about who gets to make decisions about private property." Her questions revealed a deeper understanding of the issues at stake. She requested copies of documentation, studied the timeline of events, and interviewed other alliance members about their experiences. The resulting article, published on a Sunday morning, was a masterpiece of investigative journalism. Titled, "Power and Property: The Hidden Costs of HOA Overreach," it placed Mark's story within a larger context of community governance and property rights. The piece wasn't just about one parking lot. It was about the delicate balance between community interests and individual rights. The impact was immediate and far-reaching. Local television stations picked up the story, their cameras capturing the now empty parking lot and the no parking signs that had sparked the controversy. Social media exploded with discussions as residents from other communities shared similar experiences with HOA overreach. Miss Langston's attempt to control the narrative backfired spectacularly. Her press statement, claiming the HOA was simply trying to manage community resources efficiently, was contradicted by the detailed documentation Rachel had included in her article. The timeline of events, the pattern of intimidation, the coordinated pressure campaign, all were laid bare for public scrutiny. The story gained traction beyond local media. Regional news outlets began investigating similar cases in other communities. A popular blog focusing on property rights featured Mark's story, drawing attention from legal experts and community activists. The conversation expanded beyond parking rights to questions about the proper role and limitations of HOA authority. Public opinion, once carefully manipulated by the HOA's communication strategy, began to shift. Residents from other communities reached out to share their own experiences with HOA overreach. Legal experts weighed in, pointing out the questionable legal basis for the HOA's actions. Civil rights organizations expressed interest in the case as an example of private property rights under threat. The media exposure brought unexpected allies. A state representative, already working on legislation to reform HOA regulations, reached out to Mark for testimony. Community organizations focused on property rights offered support and resources. Even some members of other HOAs contacted him privately, expressing concern about similar trends in their own communities. Throughout the media storm, Mark maintained his professional demeanor. He stuck to the facts, letting the documentation speak for itself. His measured responses and clear evidence provided a stark contrast to the HOA's increasingly defensive statements. Each interview, each news segment, each social media discussion added to the growing public understanding of the real issues at stake. The media exposure achieved what months of direct confrontation couldn't. It shifted the power dynamic. The HOA, accustomed to operating with minimal public scrutiny, now found its actions and motives under intense examination. The story had transformed from a local dispute into a symbol of broader concerns about community governance and individual rights. The community center's meeting hall had never been so packed. On a humid Thursday evening, residents filled every seat, lined the walls, and spilled out into the hallway. The emergency HOA meeting, called to address the parking crisis, had transformed into something far more significant: a public referendum on power, governance, and community values. The tension in the room was palpable as Miss Langston took her position at the podium. Gone was her usual commanding presence. Instead, she appeared defensive, almost brittle, as she faced the assembled crowd. The recent media coverage had stripped away her armor of authority, leaving her exposed to the very community she claimed to protect. "We've always acted in the community's best interests," she began, her voice lacking its usual certainty. But before she could continue, a voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. It was Harold Jenkins, the retired judge who had lived in the community for 30 years. "Best interests?" His voice carried the weight of decades of legal experience. "I've reviewed every HOA decision from the past 5 years. This isn't about community interests. It's about power and control." He stood, commanding attention with his presence. "And it's time we talked about what's really been happening." What followed was 3 hours of raw, honest community dialogue. Residents came forward one after another, sharing their own experiences with HOA overreach. Sarah Thompson, a young mother, revealed how the HOA had threatened her with fines over a small vegetable garden. Michael Rodriguez, a local teacher, described the arbitrary rejection of his home improvement plans. Each story added to a pattern of arbitrary authority and selective enforcement. The watershed moment came when Linda Martinez, the real estate agent who had joined Mark's alliance, presented her analysis. Armed with graphs and property records, she systematically dismantled the HOA's claims about property values and community impact. "The data shows that our property values have increased despite, not because of, the current HOA policies," she concluded. Her presentation met with stunned silence. Board member James Wilson, who had served alongside Miss Langston for years, stood up halfway through the meeting. "I can't do this anymore," he announced, his voice shaking. "We've lost our way. This isn't about protecting the community, it's about controlling it." His impromptu resignation sparked a cascade of revelations about internal HOA decisions and hidden agendas. The meeting reached its climax when Rebecca Chen, a longtime resident and respected community leader, called for an immediate vote of no confidence in the current HOA leadership. The motion spread through the room like wildfire, gaining support from corners that had once been Miss Langston's strongest allies. The community had found its voice, and it was demanding change. The transformation of the community didn't happen overnight, but its foundation was laid in the aftermath of that historic meeting. Miss Langston's resignation, submitted the following morning, marked the end of an era and the beginning of something new. The letter, uncharacteristically brief, acknowledged irreconcilable differences in leadership philosophy, a final attempt at dignity in defeat. The transition team, led by Rebecca Chen and including members of Mark's alliance, began the painstaking process of rebuilding community governance from the ground up. Their first action was symbolic but powerful: a formal apology to Mark and other business owners who had faced HOA harassment. The document, unanimously approved by the interim board, acknowledged past wrongs and committed to a new approach to community business relations. Mark's role in the community's transformation was unexpected. Rather than harbor resentment, he chose to participate in the healing process. When the transition team proposed creating a community business liaison committee, he was among the first to volunteer. His experience had taught him that lasting change required engagement from all stakeholders. The new HOA structure, developed over several months of community meetings, incorporated safeguards against future overreach. Clear boundaries were established between HOA authority and private property rights. Transparent decision-making processes were implemented, with multiple levels of community review required for significant actions. The parking dispute that had started it all led to comprehensive reforms in how the community handled shared resources and space allocation. Physical changes followed the administrative ones. The warehouse parking lot, once a symbol of conflict, became an example of successful boundary setting. Clear signage, respected boundaries, and professional relationships replaced the tension of previous months. Some residents even approached Mark to apologize personally for their role in the conflict, conversations that helped heal the community's social fabric. The media followed up 6 months later. Rachel Chen's follow-up article, Rebuilding Community from Conflict to Cooperation, documented the positive changes. The story was picked up by national outlets as an example of how communities could address and overcome governance challenges. Mark's experience became a case study in property rights and community relations, referenced by other HOAs facing similar issues. Perhaps the most significant change was cultural. The community learned to value dialogue over dictates, cooperation over control. The new leadership style, focused on facilitation rather than enforcement, created space for diverse voices and perspectives. Regular town halls, transparent committee meetings, and active community engagement became the norm rather than the exception. The final symbol of transformation came 1 year after the parking dispute began. The community's annual gathering, traditionally a formal affair controlled by the HOA leadership, became a genuine celebration of neighborhood unity. In the same parking lot that had once been a battlefield, residents and business owners gathered for a community festival. Mark's warehouse, its doors open and welcome, served as a reminder of how far they had come. As Mark watched children playing games in the carefully designated festival area of his parking lot, he reflected on the journey. The conflict had been painful, but it had led to necessary change. The community had learned valuable lessons about power, rights, and the importance of balance between individual and collective interests. The story of the parking lot dispute became part of community lore, retold as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of standing up for one's rights. But it was also a story of redemption, of how conflict could lead to positive change when people were willing to learn, adapt, and work together for the common good. The final payment for towing charges was processed on a Tuesday, a mundane administrative detail that marked the official end of the dispute. But the true resolution wasn't in the paperwork or the policies. It was in the new understanding that had emerged from the conflict. A understanding that recognized that strong communities are built on respect for both individual rights and collective needs, and that true leadership serves rather than controls.